Protecting the number 10 spot is Waboku, one of the oldest cards on this list with a really simple effect, because all Waboku does is prevent all of your monsters from being destroyed by battle while stopping you from taking any battle damage during the turn that you activate it. While this seems like a card you would have seen in deck lists from 2008 and not 2024, the battle phase is still a valuable tool even in the modern era. Most strategies are going to win the duel by using the battle phase to reduce an opponent's life points to 0, and even if they can't win, using battle to clear away your opponent's monsters and deprive them of potential resources is just as, if not even more effective today than it was during the classic days of the game. As a result, even nowadays, it's always a good idea to think about how you can make your opponent's battle phase less effective, especially considering the strength contained in modern OTK enablers. Some decks like Labyrinth and Eldritch will do this by pairing their powerful interaction with huge bodies that are difficult to get over, but not every deck has the same luxury, which is why you'll see slower decks like Paleozoic and Runic Stun playing cards like Waboku to ensure the duel lasts longer than just 2 turns, so they can start building up their resources. However, these strategies have a lot of choices when it comes to stopping the battle phase, a lot of which are stronger than Waboku on paper. The likes of Synchro Zone, Messenger of Peace, and even Swords of Revealing Light are able to stop your opponent's monsters from attacking or doing damage for several turns, while Waboku is only ever going to be able to protect you for just 1. And even if you only ever need to survive just 1 turn, you could also just play Threatening Roar, which prevents your opponent from being able to declare an attack at all, not only protecting your life points and monsters, but it also stops your opponent's monsters from battling entirely, cutting off access to certain battle-oriented effects or cards. But despite this, Waboku is still seen as an amazing choice for these strategies. The likes of Runic Stun definitely prefer the permanence of Synchro Zone, because the deck is capable of protecting their floodgates with their runic fusions if they're ever threatened. But in a lot of other strategies, these cards remaining on the field is just as much of a weakness as it is a strength, because if your opponent has any kind of removal, then they're suddenly not as effective. Meanwhile, if an opponent tries to deal with your Waboku, you can just chain it to apply its lingering effect, which will prevent you even after it leaves the field. Now, like we've talked about, you could also just play Threatening Roar. Like Waboku, its effect is also extremely chainable and will linger even after your opponent tries to destroy it, but it gives you a slightly wider range of protection, theoretically making it more optimal. However, while Roar is better during your opponent's turn, Waboku, strangely enough, can be used offensively just as much as it can be used defensively. The strategy that showcases this best is Paleozoic. Paleo can benefit from both Roar and Waboku, as they both do a great job of protecting your trap monsters from being destroyed by battle, while also serving as a way to bring a Paleo out to the field. Due to them being trap cards, you can also chain a Paleo too. But between the two, the deck actually prefers Waboku, because you can use it during your own turn as well, while Threatening Roar can only be used during your opponent's. The difference is a game changer, because now any spare Waboku you have can be used to swarm the field with your Paleozoics and get your engine rolling. But not only that, the specific way that Waboku protects your monsters also means you can use them to crash into your opponent's boss monster without risking destruction, allowing for even your lowest attack XC's monsters to suddenly be amazing enablers for Zeus. In general, Waboku is a really interesting card. It's been power crept by both the rapidly increasing speed of the game, as well as 25 years worth of battle faders that achieve virtually the same goal. But it's found a niche in control decks that need to survive a few turns to solidify their game plan as a great option to play. Bottled into number 9 is Prohibition, a card that essentially lets you make your own ban list, because whenever you activate it, you get to declare the name of any card in the game. And while Prohibition is on the field, cards with that name can't be used at all, with the only exception being cards that are already on the field. This does a lot to turn off your opponent's plays if you can call the right name, because Prohibition not only prevents the effects of that card from being activated, it also stops them from being able to be placed on the field, used as material for an extra deck play, or even set face down, turning some of the most busted cards in the game into virtually useless bricks. As a result, Prohibition has seen on and off competitive play over the years for 2 key applications. The first is that you can have a copy of Prohibition in your side deck, then in games 2 and 3, once you're aware what your opponent is playing, using it, call one of your opponent's key starters or engine pieces can be an absurdly oppressive floodgate that can turn off most of your opponent's potential plays. The other way to use Prohibition is if your deck really struggles against a particular hand trap or board breaker and doesn't have any real counterplay to it. because in this case you can just remove whatever card you're worried about as a factor entirely. Although in recent years we've seen a couple of other options fill this niche that usually do a much better job, with Crossout Designator being a prime example. Because with a Crossout you can activate a quick effect speed due to it being a quick play spell, and allows you to declare a card name, banish a copy of that card from your deck, and then the effects of the card or the name are negated. So if you're really worried about a particular hand trap, then instead of just blindly activating Prohibition so you can keep Crossout in hand while you're comboing off, so that if your opponent ends up activating your Silver Bullet, you can chain Crossout in response to make it useless, which allows it to beat even the likes of Maxi or Dimension Shifter that a Prohibition would be pretty bad against. And this reactive nature also makes Crossout better if your opponent doesn't have the card you're worried about as well, because you can just save it for any other piece of interaction they might have, or even just use it to stop their engine if you happen to be playing a mirror match. Now, you do need to be playing the same strategy as your opponent for Crossout to have this versatility, but even if you're not, there are other options available, such as the Black Goat Laughs, which can either lock your opponent out of special summon a specific monster by using its on-field effect, or stop a declared monster's effect from being activated if you use it in the graveyard. These effects can devastate an opponent, especially because, like Crossout, both of Black Goat's effects are quick effects, which allows you to customize what you declare based on what your opponent shows you during their turn, while Prohibition would need you to already be aware of what your opponent is playing. However, in order to get the most out of Crossout or Goat, your deck usually needs to change slightly to facilitate them. For Crossout, you have to play a large variety of staples if you want a greater coverage of cards to counter. And while Black Goat could be used by itself, it usually pops up in playability when you get the chance to add it to your hand or send it to the graveyard with a secondary engine. A lot of strategies either can't or won't alter their lists solely to use these cards, which is where Prohibition has a solid edge, as all you need to do to use the card is draw it and declare the name of your kryptonite, and suddenly your turn becomes a lot safer. And while stopping your opponent's engine is going to be difficult if you don't know what they're playing, like we've talked about earlier, you can just play it in your side deck instead as a strong card to floodgate your opponent out of the game in a duel after your opponent has showed you what they're playing, so that you never really need to rely on dumb luck. So while Prohibition has some awkward factors compared to its stronger counterparts, you can easily mitigate to make the card an amazing floodgate or anti-hand trap tool in the right circumstances, even in the modern day. And jumping down from the top rope is Dino Wrestler Pankratops, an excellent going second tool that's capable of breaking boards all on its own. You can special summon out Pank from your hand for free so long as your opponent controls more monsters than you, and while it's on the field, you can use its other effect at quick effect speed to tribute a Dino Wrestler monster you control for cost to target a card your opponent controls and destroy it. And importantly, you can tribute Pank itself to use this effect. While being pretty simple, Pank's pop has a lot of power behind it. Being able to target any card on the field makes it extremely adaptable and a strong tool against almost every deck in the game. If your opponent has a powerful boss monster on field, you can use Pankratops as a copy of Fissure, while if you're against a back row heavy matchup, Pank can be used as an MST to deal with your opponent's problematic floodgate. This effect is even crazier because of just how easy it is to commit a Pank to the field, as if your opponent has setup of any kind of board, you can just immediately slam it down to contest it, especially because Pankratops is virtually guaranteed to almost always be a 2-for-1 trade due to its really high stats. This might not sound too relevant, but it's actually pretty important, as standing at 2600 attack gives Pankratops the ability to beat over a lot of the game's best interactions, which forces your opponent to either try to spend an interaction on dealing with Pankratops, or run face first into its pop, or just accept that it's going to break the board with the battle phase. And as a result of how effective Pankratops is as a beater, there have been a number of different cards released over the years that have tried to replicate its success with similar effects, but none of them could really match up to the original. Or at least it seemed that way until the release of Kashtira Fenrir. You see, when going second, Fenrir could do a pretty amazing cosplay of Pankratops with its beefy 2400 attack stats being backed up by both a solid removal effect and a pretty easy summoning condition. But eagle-eyed viewers will notice that there's a key difference between Pank's and Fenrir's condition. Because while Pankratops needs your opponent to control more monsters, Fenrir can be summoned out so long as you control no monsters, which gives you access to its removal when going first. All you have to do is commit to Fenrir before you bring out your other monsters. And that's already great, but it's not even the extent of what Fenrir can get you, because it also has a bonus effect that lets you add any Kashtira monster from your deck to your hand. If you're willing to play a larger engine of Kashtira monsters, this effect is great as it allows you to add the likes of Riseheart to act as an extender and access the rank 7 pool. But what's even better about this search is that you don't need to be playing any kind of extra fluff, because a cast-tier Fenrir can add a second Fenrir from your deck to your hand, so while you use a Fenrir to make or break a board, you're also gaining some free card advantage in the process. But even with Fenrir doing so much more, Pankratops still finds a way into people's decks. Its ability to break a board is pretty much unmatched, even when compared to Fenrir. There's a lot of small reasons for this. Its slightly higher attack stat can make or break a truly threatening battle phase, and it being able to target set cards can make it easier to deal with your opponent's back row. But the strongest aspect of Pank is that its removal is a quick effect rather than an effect that triggers when a specific action is met. Because in order to use Fenrir's effect, you need to either activate it on a new chain after your opponent has used a monster effect, or use it whenever it declares an attack. And while these conditions aren't at all hard to fulfill, they still restrict when you can use it, and gives your opponent more opportunities to play around it. But if they tried to do the same to Pankratops, you could immediately chain it to get some free value. So even in the worst case scenarios where your Pank doesn't get to go to the battle phase, it's still trading for two of your opponent's resources, the one they use to deal with Pank and the card that you pop. So for the most part, Pankratops as an overall card is definitely outclassed by Kashtira Fenrir, as a Fenrir is just more versatile in what you can use it for. It can be a board breaker, a going second tool, or even an engine piece. But if you're looking for a reliable going second option, then Pank is still, without a doubt, at the top of the food chain. And lazing around at number 7 is Doolittle Chimera, one in a series of elemental familiars designed to support a specific attribute. In the case of Chimera, it supports fire. You need 2 fire monsters to make it, and while it's on the field, it increases the attack of all fire monsters by 500, while decreasing the attack of all water monsters by 400. And if it's ever destroyed, you get to target a fire monster in your graveyard and add it to your hand. These effects definitely don't sound game-breaking, but there was a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where Chimera and the other familiars were among the best utility links in the game, and a lot of that has to do with the early introduction of Master Rule 4, which made it so that you couldn't summon out any monsters from the extra deck unless you brought it out to an extra monster zone, or to a zone that a link monster pointed to. And back when links were first introduced, very few non-link focused strategies had their own reliable and easy access to links that they could use to facilitate their extra deck plays. But the slow introduction of the familiars over the course of several sets gave strategies that shared their attributes a boon, as they all had great arrows and solid bonus effects, with Doolittle Chimera being a great choice for fire decks like Infernoid and Metal Foes, Mistar Boy being an instant inclusion in Paleozoic Frog strategies, and of course Mrs. Radiant seeing some crazy success in Zodiac. But over the years, the need for the elemental familiars generally waned. More generic links with strong arrows were being introduced to the game, and all the while their older archetypes were gradually getting link monsters specifically tailored to their strategies. And with the Master Rule 4 revision soon coming into play, decks that once relied on these link 2s for the arrows no longer had to play them to facilitate their extra deck plays, and could free up spots in their extra deck for better options. Now, the familiars would still see a decent chunk of success because their effects certainly aren't terrible. But in the modern day, if you're playing a link 2 centered around a specific attribute, you're usually better off playing the Charmer monsters instead. Not only were they all easier to access, since only one of the monsters used as link materials had to share their attribute, but they also are just some of the best extension and link climbing tools currently legal because they can bring up monsters of their associated attributes from your opponent's graveyard. And that's not all, because like the familiars, they also have an effect whenever they're destroyed, which allows you to add any monster of their attribute from your deck to your hand, so long as they had 1500 or less defense, which makes them excellent going second tools that can act as extension, or even a way to find your deck starters in a pinch. But even with all of that being said, sometimes the familiars do still pop up as playables. Sometimes it's just because the attack boost is something that certain strategies can appreciate, but more recently, and more interestingly, we've seen cards with Doolittle Chimera and extra decks specifically because of how its on-destruction effect works. You see, Fire King is a strategy based around destroying your own fire monsters to trigger their effects and snowball into a ton of advantage. However, if you were to destroy a Hita with Fire King Island or Promethean Princess's effect, you wouldn't actually get to use its search at all, as she specifically needs to be destroyed by an opponent's card, so popping her is only going to put you down on link material. However, Doolittle Chimera's effect can be used whenever it's destroyed by either player. And because of how easy it is for a deck like Fire King to seed the graveyard with the likes of Gurinix, you can even curate the cards that a Doolittle Chimera can get you, which has made an amazing way of cycling Kirin back to your hand. But that's not all, because Doolittle's typing also just happens to be perfect for this strategy, as being a beast type monster means that an Arvata can bring it back out from the graveyard for some free link materials, which is an extra cute synergy that really makes the card worth it. In general, these kinds of small differences in wording can often seem like they don't matter, but in the right strategies, these tiny things can make a world of difference, and has allowed for both Hita and Doolittle to see play in the same extra decks as two independently strong fire link monsters. And shifting dimensions at number 6 is both Dimensional Fissure and Macrocosmos, two cards that have been made common features of anti-meta strategies over the years. These cards essentially do the same thing. They're both continuous cards that cause things that would be sent to the graveyard to be banished instead, with Macrocosmos technically being the stronger of the two, as its effect applies to all cards, while Dimensional Fissure only banishes monsters. And this is absurdly strong, because even back during the early days of the game, decks that could use the graveyard as an effective tool often held an advantage over everything that couldn't, as it meant these strategies had an extra resource they could tap into to swing the game in their favor. As a result, since their release, cards like Dimensional Fissure and Macrocosmos have solidified themselves as mascots for decks that don't have the same kind of graveyard recursion, and can turn a lack of reliance on the graveyard from a big flaw into a huge advantage with the ability to cut off one of your opponent's most important resources. However, while these cards can essentially win games by themselves, they have one key issue. They struggle to have much impact when going second because your opponent gets the chance to use the graveyard as much as they like during their first turn. But currently, there's actually a way to ensure that all of your opponent's cards end up being banished no matter who goes first. Dimensional Shifter. You see, Shifter does virtually the same thing as Macrocosmos, although it's harder to use. You need to have no cards in your graveyard at all if you want to activate it, and it only lasts until the end of the next turn. But even with those downsides, Shifter has become one of the most busted banishing tools in the game, because it can skip your opponent's first turn if you go second and see it in hand. This has meant that Shifter has superseded both Cosmos and Fissures in use because in every game where you draw it in your opening hand, it's always going to be useful. It's an excellent floodgate to back up going first end boards and make it impossible to play through. And it can build a board impossible for your opponent if you draw going second. There's just no losing if you draw it. But even with Shifter being the current preferred tool of banish focused strategy, Fissure and Cosmos are still crazy cards in their own right, and will often see play alongside Shifter. In slower, grindier decks like Stun, the permanence of a Macrocosmos is often way more valuable than the instant reward of a Shifter, especially if you can back up your Cosmos with a bunch of powerful trap cards to force a long game. Likewise, Fissure, despite being a weaker card on the surface, can actually be a pretty good going second tool in the right formats where your opponent might try to use the graveyard during your turn. But of course, the place where these cards shine more than anywhere else in the modern era is in the side deck. It can be somewhat risky to play Floodgates with strong effects in your main deck, as you can't always assume that you're going to go first. But by playing them in your side deck, you can add them into your main duels where you know you're going first as essentially an auto win. But as a whole, both Cosmos and Fissure are honestly just as amazing right now as they were back when they first released. And if anything, having only aged better with time as the speed of the game has increased. They're just somewhat outclassed by Shifter, but banishing your opponent's stuff is always going to be oppressive no matter what card is doing it. And riding into number 5 is Knightmare Unicorn, an amazing removal option that's actually only been power crept somewhat recently. In order to make Unicorn, you need to link 3's worth of materials by using at least 2 monsters, with the only restriction being that the monster you use need to be different names. And it comes with an okay bonus effect while it's co-linked that allows you to change your normal draw in the draw phase to instead draw cards for each different co-linked monster. But that's not the effect most people know it for. Its best effect happens whenever it's link summoned and simply lets you discard a card to target a card in the field and shuffle it into the deck. And you even get a free draw if you activate this effect when Unicorn was co-linked. On its own, this made Unicorn a versatile link 3 due to how strong this style of removal is. Returning a card to the deck dodges any kind of destruction protection, while stopping your opponent from being able to use any nasty graveyard effects against you, which made it a premier tool when it came to trying to break down boards. But in recent years, Unicorn became synonymous with one card in particular, IP Masquerena. Masquerena allows you to perform a link summon during your opponent's main phase, which isn't impressive on its own, but when paired with the right link monster to summon, it has the potential to be a devastating interaction. And for a while, Unicorn was that link monster, as now you could just use the removal effect in your opponent's turn, which made it a great piece of interaction that can be made with almost any 3 spare bodies. And within the past year, Masquerena has become even more of a stable endboard piece. but Unicorn hasn't seen the same amount of competitive success despite these extra deck monsters being part and parcel once upon a time. And that's because of a new option for Masquerade to summon that's even better than Unicorn in almost every single way. That of course being SP Little Knight. Like Unicorn, SP has a removal effect on Link Summon that lets you target a card in the field or in the graveyard and banish it, but only so long as you use a Fusion, Synchro, Link, or Xyz monster as its material for its summon. Although if you use this effect, you can't attack directly for the rest of the turn. If this was the only use of Little Knight, it would still be a pretty crazy upgrade no matter whose turn you summon it on. With SP, you don't need to discard anything to use her effect, which makes her way less of a resource sink. But what makes this effect better is that you can deal with both on-field threats and potentially powerful graveyard effects, which gives Little Knight an absurd amount of versatility compared to Unicorn, who can only ever deal with your opponent's cards that are on the field. But Little Knight gets even wilder. As well as her on-summon removal, she also has an extra piece of interaction that you can use whenever your opponent activates any kind of card or effect to temporarily banish 2 monsters on the field, including at least 1 card you control until the end phase. This effect is bursting with utility and really drives Little Knight over the edge as an excellent extra deck tool because they can be used in a myriad of different ways. If you just want to remove an opponent's monster from the field before they can use it for an extra deck play, you can use Little Knight to banish itself and that monster that you don't want them to have, so that you can just beat over them when they eventually pass to you. But you can also use Little Knight to temporarily banish your own cards as well to dodge any kind of removal or targeted negation. Unicorn, for as strong as its removal is, just can't match up to Little Knight's overall versatility. But regardless of how worse it is, you'll still see Unicorn in people's extra decks even in the current format. And one of the reasons why is a pretty unfortunate one: budget. At the time of writing this script, SP Little Knight is an insanely expensive staple whose only reprint is going to be in high rarity. So while Unicorn might be a heavier investment of card advantage, a Little Knight is going to cost you a lot more than just cards if you're hoping to get one for your deck. And if you're solely looking for a good target to summon for Masquerade, then it's just more efficient wallet-wise to buy a Unicorn for a few cents than a Little Knight for $50. But sometimes it's not even a matter of price. Sometimes Unicorn is genuinely just more preferable because for as great as Little Knight's removal effect is, it does come with a strangely impactful downside that prevents you from attacking directly for the rest of the turn after you use it. This doesn't sound like a big deal at first, but by activating this effect during your own turn, your opponent can feel safe in knowing that it's going to be way harder for you to OTK, and virtually guarantees that they're going to get an extra turn in order to stage a comeback. However, Unicorn has no such restriction. If anything, it actually makes OTKing even easier, specifically because it's a Link 3 monster. This makes it the perfect tool for trying to link climb into Access Code Talker with an extra body, and gives this OTK enabler an impressive 5300 attack due to Unicorn's Link rating. And with it also removing a potential threat from the field before you have to commit to your game ender, sometimes the steed is better than the knight. And it's really nice to see that. For as much as we've talked about how Unicorn is less than ideal in most situations, there are some pretty common niches it fulfills where this champion of budget deck building isn't always just a concession done at a price. It can sometimes be the optimal choice. And flying into number 4 is DD Crow, one of the game's oldest and most reliable hand traps. Since its release, Crow has been a great way of dealing with your opponent's graveyard. Because at quick effect speed, you can activate Crow by sending it from your hand to the graveyard for cost to target any card in your opponent's graveyard and banish it. Just like we talked about with Dimensional Fissure, there are a lot of decks out there that are strengthened by the ability to use the graveyard, and cutting off that resource in some way is really important for putting a stop to your opponent, which is why DD Crow has always managed to find its way to deck lists, as it's just a very clean way of depriving your opponent of a specific resource. From banishing their reborn target to even preventing an effect from being activated at all by removing a specific card at an opportune moment. Having ways to interact with your opponent's graveyard is always going to be a good thing in Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially in the modern era, which is why there's been a ton of hand traps released over the years that can help you screw over your opponent's graveyard in different ways. And we've actually discussed a couple of these in the last list where we talked about Ghost Spell and Skullmeister's place in the meta. But since then, we've actually gotten a whole archetype of cards capable of banishing your opponent's graveyard. The Bystials are an archetype composed of mostly hand traps that you can activate in hand as quick effects if your opponent controls a monster, and allows you to banish a light or dark monster from either graveyard in order to special summon themselves. This gives the Bystials the same utility as DD Crow if you're going up against any kind of chaos attribute strategy, but instead of just banishing your opponent's monsters, you also get to slam down a 2500 attack beatstick. And it gets even better because each of the Bystials also comes with powerful bonus effects too, which reward you from bringing them out, from Baldrake being another piece of interaction, or Magma Hut letting you search any dragon during your end phase, which can net you anything from engine to yet another bestial. Now, the bestials are pretty specific in their use as hand traps, as you can only really use them as a way to counter light and dark focus strategies. But it just so happens that the best decks that can use the graveyard usually happen to be composed of light and dark monsters anyway. And so against these decks, while DD Crow can still be useful, it's going to feel way weaker discarding it when you can have instead slammed down a 2500 stack beatstick in its place, while doing virtually the same thing. But using the graveyard definitely isn't exclusive to chaos attributed monsters. And if you're ever against a fire, water, wind, or earth focused strategy, then an in-hand bestial is going to feel pretty bad while you watch your opponent freely use their graveyard. But DD Crow isn't limited in the same way, and that versatility is what makes the card so appealing. It might be infinitely worse to have Crow in your deck when facing Voiceless Voice or Fiendsmith, but Crow is going to do way more into Rescue Ace or Shark deck than a bestial ever could. As a result, there's a really interesting relationship between Crow and the bestials that we get to see gradually evolve, and seeing them in people's lists can give us a good idea of what's happening in the current metagame. When bestials are in people's decks, we can assume that the format has centralized around a strong light or dark strategy. But if we're seeing Crow instead, it either means that there is a good non-chaos attributed deck in the format, or that there's a ton of diversity in the top decks, so having Crow as a catch-all that does something into everything is really valuable. And that's really interesting, because even if bestials were released for every other attribute, Crow's sheer versatility means it's always going to be an option, as it's always going to do something, even if it isn't as absurd as its dragon brothers. And rolling over the number 3 spot is Dark Ruler No More, a breaker that can sweep away all of your opponent's interactions. Because by activating Dark Ruler, you get to negate the effects of all face-up monsters your opponent controls, with the only downside being that your opponent takes no damage at all until the end of the turn. And the best part of this is that when you activate Ruler, your opponent's monsters can't do anything about it because neither player can use monster effects in response to its activation. Dark Ruler is an incredible card to see in your opening hand while your opponent is comboing off. While they're setting up a field of infinite interactions, you can feel safe in the knowledge that with just a single card you can turn their busted boss monsters and floodgates into vanilla beatsticks, with all of the resources they dumped into making an unoutable board going down the drain. But no matter how crazy Dark Ruler is as a breaker, it definitely isn't the end-all be-all of board breakers, and has a couple of weaknesses that can be exploited to make it way less effective. For example, it being a normal spell means that it can struggle with monsters that either aren't on the field yet, or that applies some kind of lingering floodgate that can be used before you reach your main phase. So against certain boards, Ruler isn't going to trade for as much as you'd hope. But even without those as factors, sometimes your opponent will go all in on the board that seems like it should lose a Dark Ruler No More, but actually doesn't due to the specific way Dark Ruler prevents players from responding. Because while your opponent won't be able to respond with their monster effects, they can use spell or trap cards instead. This lets them do something as simple as using Judgment, but it can also give them an avenue for their monster to negate Dark Ruler, with Fiendsmith Desiree being a really good example of this. When your opponent tries a Dark Ruler, you can chain any back row card in response and then use Desiree to negate the face-up Dark Ruler, because it's being used in response to your back row card and not Dark Ruler itself. And even if everything does go right for Dark Ruler, if it ever resolves, your opponent knows that they're getting a second turn because you have no way of OTKing them when they can take no damage. So you always have to contend with their follow-up. However, there is a card out there that doesn't have these flaws and does the same thing as Dark Ruler No More, that being Forbidden Droplet. Like Ruler, Droplet can negate an entire field with its effects, and in doing so will also have the attack of all the monsters it negates, making them easy to beat over, and even opening up lines to OTK that might not have been available before, because Droplet doesn't share the same damage reduction downside. And as well as preventing your opponent from responding with monsters, Droplet can also prevent your opponent from responding with any card type, so long as you send the right cards for its particular cost, even preventing everyone's favorite old man from saying no. And perhaps the biggest upside from Droplet compared to Dark Ruler is that it's a quick play spell, which gives Droplet a wider array of uses against cards that Dark Ruler would be useless against. You can use it in response to an opponent's Abyss Dweller to negate it, to stop an opponent's Kaleido Heart that's just been summoned, or even during your opponent's turn to act like a copy of Infinite Impermanence, which makes Droplet a solid card when going first as well as when going second. However, for as good as Forbidden Droplet is, it requires way more cards to use, and sometimes you need to have specific kinds of cards to get the most out of it. You see, in order to use Droplet, you need to send a number of cards from your hand or field to the graveyard equal to the number of monsters you want to negate. So, if you need to deal with 5 or more monsters, you'll have to trade an entire hand's worth of cards. But with Dark Ruler, you'll only need itself, freeing up the rest of your hand to push through a board. And this is really important because of the way Droplet being unrespondable works. We mentioned earlier that Droplet can prevent your opponent from responding with any card type, but that's only so long as you send every card type to the graveyard for its cost. If you don't send a monster, then your opponent can still respond with monster effects. If you don't send a spell, then there's an opening for spell cards to interact with you, and if you don't send a trap card, that leaves Droplet wide open to being hit with Solemn Judgment. And very few decks are ever going to have the opportunity to send all 3 at once. This isn't so much a problem if your opponent puts all their eggs into a specific couple of interactions, but it means that if your opponent gets a chance to negate Droplet, it's going to be even more devastating due to the heavier investment of resources. And while Ruler is definitely subject to the same issues, you're trading 1 card for interaction rather than 3 or 4 cards instead. Droplet is without a doubt an insane card, but it's a huge resource sink no matter how you look at it, and that's something not every deck can always afford. So while Dark Ruler might be less applicable and has more counterplay, it's always going to be a reliable and low investment option that almost any deck can use. And crashing down and sweeping away number 2 spot are Raigeki and Harpy's Feather Duster, 2 classic cards from the earliest days of the game. Both of these cards have really similar effects, but for different types of cards. If you activate Raigeki, you get to destroy all monsters your opponent controls, while Harpy's Feather Duster destroys all of your opponent's back row. Wiping your opponent's field with either of these cards is a power play no matter which era of Yu-Gi-Oh you're in. Raigeki is a terrifying board breaker even in the modern format, due to how capable it is of thundering away your opponent's interactions, utility tools, and boss monsters with just a single card. And if you've ever been hit by Harpy's Feather Duster, you know just how devastating it can be for back row strategies to have all your best trap cards cleared away in one fell swoop. So much so that for these decks to be competitively viable, they need to have a way to beat Duster in mind. However, one of the issues that these cards have is that they're pretty targeted for certain matchups. Feather Duster isn't going to feel safe into a board of monsters, and Raigeki might as well be a Toon World if your opponent sets 5 and passes. And in formats where every card you draw matters, having a dead card in hand can be a death knell, which is why some players often gravitate towards options like Lightning Storm or Evenly Matched. Cards that can clear a field like Raigeki and Duster, but can apply to more situations. In the case of Lightning Storm, you'll never be caught out by a specific matchup, as when you activate it, you can change its effect to either act like a copy of Raigeki by destroying all attack position monsters your opponent controls, or to a copy of Duster by clearing their back row. But you can only use it if you control no face-up cards. Likewise, Evenly acts as a board wipe of both at the same time, as if it ever resolves, your opponent is only going to be left with 1 card if you use it from your hand, wiping away every other on-field resource they have, whether that's a monster, a spell, or a trap card. Although in order to use Evenly, it has to be used at the end of the battle phase, and if you want to use it from your hand, you need to control no cards. But just like with a lot of other cards in this list, the simplicity of the original is a huge part of their strength. In terms of clearing away monsters, a Raigeki is going to be more effective than a Lightning Storm because it has virtually no conditions. For LS to do the same thing, your opponent's monsters need to be in attack position. So in formats where it's around, your opponent is conscious of it, they can easily play around the card by summoning their best monsters in defense mode. Meanwhile, Storm's ability to clear any back row is basically on par with Duster, which is actually the main reason people play the card in the first place, with the Raigeki-like effect just being a bonus. Clearing away an opponent's spell and trap cards is always just a really strong effect, which is why, even though Duster can't clear monsters away, people will still play it alongside Storm to have as many options to beat trap decks as possible. And Evenly Matched is much of the same boat, because even though it seems like it has all the utility of Raigeki and Duster wrapped into the same effect, it's more of an alternative choice than anything. It's an extremely strong card for having the dual utility, but it requires an absurd amount of investment since you have to give up your battle phase to use it, which not only means that your opponent is guaranteed to live to their next turn, but also means that a negated Evenly is way more devastating. But even when it's guaranteed to resolve, it still leaves the opponent with an important resource. Their most important resource, actually, because no matter how you use it, you'll always have 1 card on the field when you activate Evenly Match, that being Evenly itself. So your opponent will always get to keep their best card in every situation. As a result, even though Evenly definitely does more on paper, sometimes more targeted options like Raigeki and Duster are going to have more impact by clearing away all of a specific type of card that you know your opponent relies on to guarantee that their best threats are neutralized. Especially because these cards let you keep your battle phase, which allows you to capitalize on a field wiping effect by swooping in for a swift OTK. So as a whole, there's always going to be a place in Yu-Gi-Oh! For cards like Raigeki and Duster, because wiping a field is just always going to be a great effect, which is also why Lightning Storm and Evenly are also great cards in the modern era. But the ways they wipe the field give them utility that's a bit different than their older versions. Different enough at least to allow for every one of these cards to have their own niche. And drawing in at number 1, we have both Pot of Desires and Pot of Extravagance. Two cards that we actually use as an example of power creep in the previous list to show just how far we've come since Pot of Duality. Because at the time, Desires and Extravagance were just better consistency than a Duality, as they were way less restrictive. With Extravagance, you can banish 3 or 6 random cards from your extra deck to draw 1 or 2 cards respectively, with the only restriction being that you have to use it at the start of your main phase 1, and that you can't draw for the rest of the turn after activating it. And Desires doesn't even have any restrictions to speak of other than being a hard once per turn. So to draw 2 cards from it, all you have to do is banish the top 10 cards of your deck. This kind of consistency tool is something that almost every deck in the modern era wants to have. There's a reason that Pot of Greed is still on the ban list after all. The strength of individual cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is so strong that they have the potential to turn a duel on its head at any given moment, so a draw 2 can either save a doomed hand by giving you a starter, or make an already strong hand overwhelming if you happen to get an extender or hand traps. And that kind of promise is exactly why both Extravagance and Desires are seen as incredibly valuable options despite their costs. The banishes can definitely screw you over, but the draw 2 that you get from them has the potential to be game warping enough that it's more likely to help you than their costs are to hurt you, especially if you're willing to deck build with these cards in mind to minimize the chances of them banishing a valuable card by going all in 3-ups. But even with these cards feeling downright busted sometimes, there's been yet another pot card release in recent years that has managed to be even crazier than both. So much so that it's the only other pot card that's somewhere on the Forbidden Limited list alongside Pot of Greed, which is Pot of Prosperity. And that might be hard to see at first because Prosperity doesn't even net you any kind of card advantage, since it can only get you 1 card by using its effect, making it net neutral while both Extravagance and Desires can be +1s. But the crazy part about Prosperity isn't the card advantage it provides. It's the card quality it gets you for its relatively small cost. You see, when activating Prosperity, you get a choice similar to Extravagance, where you can banish either 3 or 6 cards. But instead of drawing, you reveal cards from the top of your deck, equal to the number of cards you banish from your extra deck, and choose one from amongst the ones you have in order to add to your hand. This makes finding a combo piece or busted one-offs way more consistent, as if you start with Prosperity on the first turn of the duel and you banish 6, you'll see 11 cards, which would be over a quarter of your deck if you play 40. And this actually makes it way better than just drawing 2 cards, because instead of gambling on good draws, excavating 6 to choose 1 is more than likely to give you exactly what you need, since you can just grab the best card from the bunch. This gets even better because when you banish with Prosperity, unlike the other pots, what gets banished isn't random. You get to pick them. With Desires and Extravagance, you can theoretically be punished if you're playing a lot of 3-ofs, as there's always a chance, however small, that you banish every copy of an important card. But there's virtually no risk to Prosperity's banish, as you can just trade the least important cards in your extra deck for some free consistency. The extra deck tools you have available to you will always be up to your discretion. But even with Prosperity being an undeniably busted card, Desires and Extravagance are still amazing in their own right, because sometimes certain strategies will value card quantity over card quality. In a deck like Labyrinth, for example, where every draw is either a strong engine piece or a powerful trap card, then the decision between Prosperity and Extravagance is a really interesting one. Prosperity lets you flex your extra deck and will always get you your engine no matter what, but with every potential draw from Extravagance being excellent, they can apply a lot more pressure to an opponent to save you in a disadvantageous game state by the virtue of just having 1 extra card to turn a duel around. Both of these cards are valid options for the strategy. You just have to determine whether or not you think your deck prefers quantity or quality for your consistency tool. And while there's no hard and fast rule, there are a couple of things to keep in mind when deciding your pot card of choice. If you're playing an inconsistent deck that needs to see specific cards at all times to play, then it doesn't make sense to gamble on a draw. So you would definitely prefer quality. But if you're playing a deck like Sword Soul or Salamangreat, where every draw you have is going to be a strong extender, a starter, or a powerful generic tool, then having more of those good cards is just going to be better than 1. So you're always picking a card like Desires instead. And it's not like drawing 2 is ever going to be a bad effect in Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially if you've managed to build your deck in a way to mitigate the potential costs of a card like Extravagance or Desires. And these 3 cards are all existing at the same time, which opens up some really interesting discussion about what we really want from our pot cards. which allows for these cards to stand on their own as alternatives to prosperity rather than really being classed as redundant. Hey there, for 1 week only, we have a new mystery bag on the merch store. These Black Friday mystery bags have 5 random pieces of merch from the store, along with an exclusive spider token card and a chunky holographic spider sticker. In addition, each one will have either a rare Yu-Gi-Oh card, a replica Pokemon video game, or a Pokemon plush. I made sure to get some copies of Dominus Impulse and Fuelos to give away just for these bags. With 5 random pieces of merch, 2 exclusives, and 1 high value item, you might expect something like this to go for $8,000. But no, it's only $25 plus shipping, and you save on shipping if you buy multiple items at a time, like you want one of the mystery boxes too. Supplies are limited, and you only have through Black Friday week to purchase the bag before it's gone forever.